They boarded the ship hand in hand, faces glowing with the kind of joy that only comes once in a lifetime. It was August 17th, 1985, and for Mark and Lisa Whitaker, it was the beginning of forever. Newly married, full of plans, and completely in love, they set sail on a week-long honeymoon cruise through the Caribbean. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they'd be seen alive. The ship, the Oceana Star, departed from Miami with nearly 1,800 passengers on board. A floating city of laughter, clinking glasses, and postcard sunsets. Mark and Lisa were spotted dining, dancing, and even posing for one of those tourist photos near the deck rail. Everything seemed normal until the morning of the 5th day. Their cabin was empty. Their belongings were untouched. Their keycards had not been used since midnight. At first, there was confusion, then worry. And within hours, the captain was making an announcement. 2 passengers were missing. Searches were conducted on board. The U.S. Coast Guard was contacted. Lifeboats were checked. But there was no trace of the young couple, no signs of struggle, no indication they had left the ship at port, and no evidence they had fallen overboard. It was as if they had simply disappeared into the ocean air. Over the years, the story faded into maritime folklore, a honeymoon mystery that was filed away among the many strange cases at sea. Family members clung to hope, but with no bodies and no answers, the case grew colder with each passing decade. That is, until 35 years later. In the summer of 2020, a deep-sea salvage crew diving off the coast of the Bahamas made a chilling discovery. A long-lost wreck of a private yacht, reported missing in the late 80s, buried inside the corroded hull beneath layers of silt and rust. They found something they didn't expect. A sealed compartment untouched by time. Inside was a suitcase, waterlogged, sealed with duct tape. And what was inside that suitcase would unravel everything. Forensic teams were called, DNA testing began, and within weeks, investigators had confirmation. Mark and Lisa Whitaker had not disappeared into the ocean. They had been taken, and their story, long buried under the waves, was just beginning to surface. August 17th, 1985. It was one of those hot, gleaming Florida mornings where the sky looked almost unreal, painted in perfect shades of blue, no clouds, no wind, just stillness. Mark and Lisa Whitaker arrived at Port Miami just before 10 a.m., their suitcases rattling across the asphalt, their hands intertwined, laughing at something only they understood. They had been married exactly 6 days. High school sweethearts from Columbus, Ohio. Mark was 25, a mechanical engineer with a quiet voice and a dependable charm. Lisa, 23, had just graduated nursing school. Her laugh was contagious. She had big, expressive eyes and a habit of narrating her thoughts out loud, which always made Mark smile. They were one of those couples who seemed impossibly happy. To anyone watching them that morning, they looked like the beginning of something, not the end. They boarded the Oceana Star around noon, taking photos in front of the ship's emblem and posing by the handrails, just like every other couple. The ship was one of the newer models at the time. 10 decks, multiple dining rooms, pools, theaters, bars, even a casino. It was a floating luxury city, bound for a 7-day cruise through the Bahamas, with stops at Nassau, Half Moon Cay, and San Salvador Island. The first 2 days were pure joy. Photos captured them at the onboard luau, dancing beneath paper lanterns. One waiter later recalled Lisa joking about trying every dessert on the menu before they docked. They were seen playing cards with another couple on Deck 6, sipping daiquiris, tanned and glowing. According to their assigned steward, they kept their room tidy. Lisa left thank-you notes on the pillows. Mark was always polite. There were no signs of tension, no arguments, no odd requests. Just a couple in love. On the 4th night, the ship hosted a formal dinner and ballroom event. Passengers were encouraged to dress up. Mark wore a navy blue blazer. Lisa wore a pale green gown with pearl earrings. A photograph from that night would later become the image plastered across news reports. The two of them smiling, arms wrapped around each other, backlit by golden light. But something changed after midnight. At 7:45 a.m. the next morning, their steward knocked on their door to offer breakfast service. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Assuming they were sleeping in, he moved on. By noon, the room was still untouched. Housekeeping entered and found everything in place. Neatly made bed, 2 cruise lanyards hanging on the hook, suitcases unzipped but not packed. The only thing out of place was the fact that the bed hadn't been slept in at all. Their key cards had last been used at 11:56 p.m. the night before to access their cabin. Security checked dining logs, surveillance footage, and bar tabs. They hadn't been seen on any public deck since the ballroom. No one had seen them disembark at the last port, and there were no excursions booked for that morning. That evening, the ship's captain made an announcement. 2 guests were unaccounted for. All passengers were asked to report anything they may have seen. The ship was searched from bow to stern. Every room, every service closet, every emergency exit. Crew members walked the decks, checking lifeboats and balconies. Divers were dispatched into the surrounding waters, though by then the ship had already moved miles since their last confirmed sighting. No evidence was found. No blood, no broken glass, no open balcony door, no clothing, no struggle. The FBI was notified, as maritime law dictates in U.S.-linked disappearances at sea. But the moment the ship docked back in Miami, the investigation began slipping through bureaucratic cracks. Mark and Lisa's families flew to Florida within days. Their parents were distraught, holding up photos, demanding answers. Reporters hounded the cruise line, but statements were vague. "We are cooperating fully with authorities. There is no indication of foul play. We cannot speculate." Behind closed doors, investigators couldn't agree. Some believed the couple had voluntarily jumped, a romantic suicide pact. Others whispered about a possible third party, a crew member, another passenger. Something happened that night after the ballroom, but no one could say what. A few people claimed to remember seeing them walking on the upper deck after midnight, but no time-stamped footage existed. Surveillance on the ship in 1985 was rudimentary. Cameras were limited to entry points and casino areas. There was no wide coverage like today. As days turned into weeks, leads thinned. The cruise line offered condolences, not compensation. A private investigator hired by Lisa's father spent months interviewing passengers, chasing rumors, checking passport records at Caribbean ports. Nothing concrete ever came back. And without a crime scene, without witnesses, and most damning of all, without bodies, there was only so much anyone could do. Mark and Lisa Whitaker were declared legally dead in 1992. Their families, after years of clinging to hope, held 2 memorial services, one in Ohio, one in Florida. Empty caskets, half-filled rooms. But not everyone moved on. Lisa's younger sister, Claire, never accepted the story. She believed something had happened, something orchestrated, something hidden. In a 1997 local interview, she said, "They didn't just vanish. Someone made them vanish. We just haven't found out who." At the time, no one listened. The world had moved on, but the ocean hadn't. And 35 years later, it would finally give something back. The memorials were quiet affairs, marked by an unbearable emptiness. No remains, no urn, no grave to visit. Just words, framed photos, and questions that no one could answer. Mark's parents sat in the front row of the Ohio service, barely able to speak through their grief. Lisa's sister, Claire, delivered a eulogy through clenched teeth. She didn't want closure. She wanted truth. Theirs was not a loss she could explain. The logic didn't hold. Two people don't simply disappear from a boat with 1,800 passengers, especially not without a single scream, witness, or trace. After the declarations of death in 1992, the world seemed ready to forget. The cruise company changed names. The ship, the Oceana Star, was eventually decommissioned in 1998, stripped for parts, and later sold to a private shipping company in the Netherlands. No longer a leisure liner, it was converted into a freight transport vessel and renamed Maris Sol. This piece of information would become critical years later, but in the early 90s, it barely made a ripple. Lisa's parents held on longer than most. Her mother, Ruth, continued to send letters to international agencies for nearly a decade: cruise lines, maritime safety boards, the FBI. Nothing ever came back but silence or vague apologies. When she passed away in 2004, a cardboard box filled with newspaper clippings, travel brochures, and handwritten notes about the ship was found under her bed. A personal archive of grief no one else ever saw. Mark's younger brother, Aaron, became obsessed in a different way. He began researching disappearances at sea. Not just cruise vanishings, but fishing boats, private vessels, even submarines. He compiled timelines, shipping routes, weather reports. He insisted that maritime law was too outdated, that international waters provided too many shadows for the truth to hide in. His theories were often dismissed as speculative at best, conspiratorial at worst. But some of them weren't wrong, because in truth, the investigation had been incomplete from the start. For example, no one had properly interviewed every crew member. Due to tight schedules and legal red tape, several foreign staff aboard the ship were released from duty before U.S. investigators could process them. One Filipino deckhand assigned to midnight cleanup duty near the upper pool was never questioned. His name wasn't even recorded in the final case file. One bartender was noted in the log as nervous during initial questioning. He'd served the couple multiple drinks the night of their disappearance, possibly the last person to interact with them. But he left the ship in Nassau and never returned for further interviews. No follow-up was conducted. Why? Because in 1985, there was no clear jurisdiction. International waters diluted accountability. Cruise lines weren't required to store full surveillance tapes, and the preservation of evidence was, at best, haphazard. There was no centralized database, no cruise ship black boxes, no GPS tracking bracelets. It was an era of freedom, movement, and very little oversight, which made it perfect for anyone wanting to make someone disappear. Claire, still convinced that foul play was involved, began working with private investigators again in the early 2000s. She appeared on a local true crime radio program in 2005, then in a regional documentary series in 2008. She posted on online forums, often under aliases, relaying every detail she could recall. The color of Lisa's dress that night, the name of the bar they last danced in, the number of steps from the ballroom to their cabin. But even as she searched, time eroded the trail. Key witnesses died or disappeared. Records were lost in warehouse floods. Photographs faded. The ship, now working as a freight vessel in Europe, bore no signs of its past life until 2020. That summer, an independent salvage crew, funded by a private marine history foundation, was conducting exploratory dives off the eastern coast of the Bahamas. They were looking for wreckage from colonial-era trade routes, sunken cargo ships mostly. Instead, they found something else. Roughly 12 miles off a lesser-known reef shelf, sitting at a tilt beneath 120 feet of water, was a rusted metal frame that matched no active listings. It wasn't ancient. It wasn't from the 1700s. This was a modern yacht, mid-sized, once white, but now streaked with algae and rust, partially buried in the sand. The dive team marked it, captured footage, and began documenting the interior. Inside, they found standard signs of shipwreck: collapsed beams, stripped-out wiring, shattered glass. But behind a warped steel panel, bolted shut and hidden beneath a corroded crate, they found something unexpected: a sealed compartment. Inside, a suitcase, waterlogged but intact, duct-taped around all edges, as if someone had deliberately tried to keep it closed. They brought it to the surface, and once opened, what they found inside sent the investigation, long dormant, surging back to life, because buried among the water-damaged clothes and documents were two objects that would change everything: a wedding ring engraved with L and M always, and a woman's clutch containing a faded passport. Lisa Whitaker, the vanished bride, last seen 35 years earlier. She hadn't drowned, she hadn't fallen. She had ended up here, at the bottom of the sea, in a ship no one was supposed to find, and someone had put her there. The years after Mark and Lisa Whitaker disappeared were marked by quiet devastation. Their names slowly faded from national headlines, then regional ones, then disappeared altogether. The world moved on, as it always does, but for those left behind, the absence never softened. It deepened. Lisa's sister, Claire, carried it with her like a second spine, invisible, but central to everything she did. In the early years, she would check newspapers for updates, answer every anonymous tip call, and call cruise lines pretending to be a reporter, hoping someone would slip and say something different. When that didn't work, she went to message boards. When those dried up, she started posting in forums, long, detailed threads with timestamps, links, theories, and pleas. She wasn't alone. A handful of online communities began to revisit the Whitaker case in the mid-2000s. One particularly active user, going by the handle Maritime Echo 84, created a full case timeline. It included a minute-by-minute breakdown of the couple's final known movements, ship schematics from 1985, a list of passengers and crew confirmed on board, and a disturbing detail: at least 3 other people had been reported missing aboard the Oceana Star during its 12-year run as a cruise ship. This information had never been connected publicly. Each incident had been considered isolated, and 2 had occurred during international portions of the cruise, meaning local jurisdictions never followed through. A pattern began to emerge, but without hard evidence it was easy to dismiss. In 2009, the FBI quietly closed the Whitaker file. The final notation read, "Presumed lost at sea. No evidence of criminal activity. Status, inactive." Claire didn't give up. She filed multiple FOIA requests for the ship's logs, internal crew rosters, and maritime investigation records. Some were denied. Others arrived so redacted they were barely legible. But the more she pulled, the more gaps she saw, especially in the investigation's handling of the Oceana Star's conversion. In 1998, the ship was sold to a Dutch shipping company and renamed Maris Sol. On paper, this was routine, but Claire discovered that during the sale, all interior fittings, including bars, furniture, carpeting, and security camera hardware, were either discarded or unaccounted for. In maritime resale terms, this isn't unusual, but it meant every physical trace of the Whitakers' last known hours was now lost. In 2012, a new spark emerged. A Dutch whistleblower posted anonymously on a defunct shipping forum, claiming that during the conversion of the Oceana Star, an unlisted room had been found sealed shut behind a false wall in the engine maintenance level. The worker said they were instructed not to touch it. The area was later welded over and marked as a supply hold. The post was deleted within hours. Claire screenshotted it. She tried to contact the poster. No reply, no trace, but the idea wouldn't leave her. An unlisted room, a sealed compartment, a hidden space on the same ship where her sister vanished. Was this where it happened? Meanwhile, across the ocean, others had begun to notice something strange. A maritime historian named Vincent Keller had been tracking converted cruise ships for a book he was writing on the ghost ships of the modern era. In his research, he found a pattern. Multiple vessels used in the 1980s for luxury travel had quietly changed hands, been re-registered in foreign ports, and had minimal inspection. Reports following conversion. One of those ships was Maris Sol, the former Oceana Star. Keller filed a salvage dive request in 2016 after the Maris Sol stopped transmitting signals and was presumed sunk off the Bahamian coast following a tropical storm. The company that had purchased the vessel declared it a total loss and moved on, but no salvage had ever been conducted. Keller, with the help of a private research group, began assembling a dive team to find it. It took 4 years, and then in 2020, they did. The wreck wasn't ancient, as originally assumed, but metallic, modern, and eerily intact. And inside they found something. That suitcase, that hidden compartment, that faded passport with Lisa Whitaker's name in the plastic sleeve. The internet exploded. News outlets resurrected the case. Claire, now in her 50s, was called upon for interviews she'd once begged for and been denied. The public suddenly cared again, not about a cold case, but a rediscovered one. The idea that a honeymoon couple had been taken, not lost, was horrifying, gripping, tragic. The suitcase was just the beginning. When forensic teams examined the materials inside, they found more. Mark's watch, his initials still etched in the back, a rusted pocket knife with fingerprints matching an unknown individual, not Mark, not Lisa, and several blank cassette tapes sealed in a separate plastic bag. Investigators used modern techniques to recover partial audio from one of the tapes. The contents were muffled, but a male voice could be heard saying phrases like, "We stay here tonight. Don't talk. It's being handled. They're worth more alive than dead." The implications were immediate and chilling. What had initially looked like a tragic accident or disappearance now resembled something much darker, a planned abduction, possibly even part of a pattern. In response, the FBI reopened the case under the umbrella of maritime kidnapping and homicide. The agency also began cross-referencing missing persons from other cruise ships in the 80s and 90s with the route logs of the Oceana Star. Within weeks, they identified 2 other cases with eerie similarities: a couple from Houston, missing in 1982 from a Caribbean cruise, never located; a solo traveler from New York, vanished mid-voyage in 1986, last seen at the bar Lisa and Mark had danced in. All on the Oceana Star, all gone without a trace, until now. With the discovery of the wreck and the items inside, Claire felt the vindication she had waited half her life for, but also a deeper, more painful truth. Her sister hadn't vanished. She had been taken, hidden, discarded. The idea was unbearable, but it also gave her something she hadn't had in decades: direction. The FBI's renewed investigation took on a wider scope. They began recontacting former crew members from the Oceana Star, including bartenders, security guards, and entertainers who had once worked the night shift. Many were now retired. A few had passed away, but others remembered odd details, pieces that never quite made sense back then, but now sent chills down their spines. One former crew member recalled a strange policy that came into effect in late 1984. An unmarked storage room on the lower decks that was off-limits to general staff. No one ever saw it used. No maintenance records existed for it. No inventory listed what was inside. Another remembered that on the night of Mark and Lisa's disappearance, security was pulled to another deck to investigate a supposed passenger altercation. No documentation of that disturbance was ever found in the logs. These were not coincidences. These were holes. As the agents dug deeper, a theory emerged. a theory darker than anyone wanted to believe at first, that someone, or some group, had been using cruise ships like the Oceana Star to quietly abduct individuals, likely for financial or exploitative reasons, during the pre-digital era, when tracking people was harder, surveillance was minimal, and international waters offered the perfect shield. It was a terrifying proposition, but it fit. Too many passengers had disappeared in similar circumstances across different ships operated by the same cruise line, always mid-voyage, always at night, and always without a trace. The motive was the murkiest part. Some suggested ransom gone wrong. Others speculated about trafficking. But no money was ever demanded, no communication was made with the families. It was as if these people were plucked from the world and erased for reasons no one could trace. One chilling detail came from the forensic team's analysis of the wrecked ship. In the sealed compartment, traces of expired sedatives were found, hidden in the lining of an old medicine pouch. The drugs matched compounds commonly used in the mid-80s to induce unconsciousness quickly and undetectably. Lisa and Mark hadn't fallen. They had been drugged, then moved, and somehow they ended up on that secondary vessel, the wreck discovered in 2020, perhaps for transport or concealment. Why they were left there, why the vessel sank, and whether anyone else was on board remains unclear. The tapes recovered, most of them blank or damaged, remain under FBI analysis. The agency released no full transcripts, only select quotes. But they were enough to confirm that at least two voices were present besides Lisa and Mark's. One voice had a non-American accent. The other sounded nervous, younger. Neither has been publicly identified. The FBI also confirmed something else. Fingerprints recovered from inside the suitcase and on the cassette tapes matched another unsolved disappearance case from 1986. The solo New York traveler, Julia Reyes. Julia had been traveling alone. She had made contact with her family via a postcard on day 3 of the cruise, and then never again. Her disappearance was considered suicide for years, but now forensic links tied her to the same unknown individual connected to the Whitakers case. 3 people, 1 ship, similar disappearances, identical signs of cover-up. A former cruise line executive under anonymity told investigators that the Oceana Star had a problem with certain rogue employees, mostly third-party contractors brought on for security and engineering work. According to him, these men were rarely background checked. Most spoke limited English. They came and went at various ports, sometimes staying on board without proper registration. He said, "We had guys below deck that nobody really accounted for. They weren't on any crew manifest, but they were always working, fixing something, moving supplies. They kept to themselves. Back then, nobody asked questions." That testimony painted a haunting picture. A shadow system operating in the underbelly of cruise lines, taking advantage of the lack of oversight in international waters. A floating gray zone. Claire, faced with these revelations, didn't cry. She acted. She used her platform, now backed by media attention, to push for legal reforms in maritime security. In 2021, she partnered with advocacy groups and congressional aides to help draft the Whitaker Maritime Protection Act, a bill that would require full digital crew and passenger manifests accessible to U.S. authorities in real time, mandatory surveillance backup on all passenger decks, expanded international cooperation for missing persons at sea. The bill has since been introduced in committee. Claire continues to lobby for it to this day. Meanwhile, the wreck of the secondary vessel, the one that held the suitcase, remains under investigation. Salvage teams have explored further into its rusted compartments, but no additional human remains were found. The theory is that Lisa and Mark may have been temporarily held there, then either perished in transit or were abandoned during a failed move. One diver recalled finding a broken chain bolted to the floor of the vessel. He said it looked like someone had been locked there. The FBI has not confirmed or denied this detail. Public reaction to the reopened case has been intense. True crime podcasts, documentary filmmakers, and YouTube channels have all covered the unfolding revelations. But what makes this case stand apart is not just its darkness. It's the fact that for 35 years, the clues were scattered in plain sight, ignored, missed, and that it took a random salvage team, a grieving sister, and the persistence of memory to finally bring light to what had been buried beneath the ocean floor. The ocean has a strange way of keeping secrets. It preserves what we try to forget, hides what we most want to find, and sometimes, when it's ready, it lets go. That's what happened in the summer of 2020. When the salvage crew discovered the wreck and recovered the suitcase, it was initially treated as a minor historical footnote, the recovery of a forgotten vessel, another piece of sunken machinery. But the moment the name Lisa Whitaker was identified on the passport, everything changed. Suddenly, this wasn't just about metal and water, it was about people. About a couple whose disappearance had haunted two families for 3.5 decades, about questions that had gone unanswered for too long. Authorities moved quickly. The site was cordoned off, the vessel was logged and reclassified, and for the first time in 35 years, the case of Mark and Lisa Whitaker was reopened. News broke worldwide. Articles flooded in. New clues emerge in 1985, Honeymoon disappearance, mystery at sea, the Whitaker files reopened, voices from the deep. But while the public was transfixed by the discovery, investigators were focused on one thing, the contents of the sealed compartment. Inside the water-damaged suitcase were several clothing items, a blouse, men's slacks, and a monogrammed handkerchief with the initials M.W. There was also a disposable camera, though the film had long been degraded, but two items stood out. The first was a pair of wedding rings, one belonging to Lisa, the other to Mark, both engraved, both verified by surviving family members. The second was a worn leather clutch containing Lisa's ID, cosmetics, and a cassette tape sealed in a plastic sleeve. It was labeled simply Day 3. Investigators worked with audio specialists to recover what they could. The tape was heavily damaged, warped by time and salt water, but fragments survived. The voices were faint, distorted, but clearly human. Don't touch that. Just keep her quiet. We'll wait. We stay here tonight. We move tomorrow. Why? They know we're missing already. Nobody knows. Not yet. Nobody's looking. Then silence. The voices didn't match Mark or Lisa's known recordings. The accent, Eastern European perhaps, remained unidentified. But the implications were clear. Mark and Lisa had been alive for some period after their disappearance. They had been taken, not lost. That one line, "Nobody's looking," it struck investigators, survivors, and audiences alike with brutal clarity. Because they were right. At the time of their disappearance, no security footage was recovered. The crew did not enforce deck logs with precision. The cruise line focused on protecting its brand rather than fully investigating. International authorities had jurisdictional limitations. The Coast Guard response was delayed. The FBI's presence was superficial at best. For decades, no one had truly been looking. But now, everything had changed. The next revelation came from the vessel itself. The ship discovered by the salvage team wasn't the Oceana Star. That much was clear. But records indicated it had been spotted off the Florida coast in early 1986, reported under a false name, Fleur du Vent. It had no active registration, no clear ownership, and had changed hands through shell companies based out of Panama. Further digging revealed that this yacht, Fleur du Vent, had once docked at a private marina in Nassau just 2 days after Mark and Lisa had been reported missing. Witnesses at the time recalled seeing 2 American tourists escorted on board by a group of unfamiliar men. One marina worker, when re-interviewed in 2020, said this: "They didn't look drunk. They looked blank, like they weren't there. I remember her. Blonde, pale. She was holding something to her stomach, like she'd been hurt." That account changed everything. The FBI now had reason to believe Mark and Lisa were abducted directly from the cruise ship and moved covertly to a secondary vessel, possibly drugged or coerced, then transported to a holding location. For what purpose remains the darkest mystery of all. Some speculate ransom. Others suggest something far more disturbing, trafficking or illegal labor. But no ransom call was ever made, no demands, no trace. And now all that remains is that sunken yacht and the eerie possibility that others may have shared their fate. The physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Inside a hidden crawl space behind a collapsed panel in the wreck's galley, divers found another item, a heavily corroded binder wrapped in plastic. Inside were documents, rosters, maps, diagrams, even passport photocopies. Most were too damaged to recover, but one sheet stood out, a checklist. Next to several handwritten names, mostly first names only, were crude annotations: L&M, taken, process complete; JR, failed, returned; 2TB, sent via San S. The initials L and M were unmistakable. Lisa and Mark. Process complete. What that meant, no one could say for sure. But combined with the tapes, the fake ship registry, and the physical condition of the suitcase, a grim narrative took shape. The Whitakers were targeted, abducted, and processed through a secret operation that operated with complete impunity on international waters. And the worst part? It had worked. For 35 years, it had worked. The implications of the recovered checklist sent shockwaves through every agency involved in the reopened investigation. The crude phrasing, the code-like entries, process complete, returned, sent via San S, all pointed to something organized, systematic, and deeply hidden. This wasn't a one-off abduction. It wasn't random. It looked like a network. But a network for what? Theories circulated among law enforcement, investigative journalists, and online sleuths. Some leaned toward an illicit trafficking ring operating through maritime routes. Others considered espionage or covert experimentation, though there was no solid evidence to support those ideas. What they knew for certain was this: the Fleur du Vent was a ghost vessel, used for human transport under false identities, outfitted for long, secretive trips, and equipped with spaces designed to restrain and isolate people. The FBI team assigned to the case began coordinating with Interpol, tracking down names and shipping logs from the 1980s that had previously gone unexamined. Dozens of flagged vessels popped up, small yachts, fishing boats, and converted cruisers with similar histories, registered in tax haven countries, bought and sold under aliases, lost at sea or abandoned in shallow coves. Some of these ships were rumored to have been used by black market groups dealing in rare goods, stolen antiquities, and sometimes people. The Whitakers were no longer just a case. They were a link. In late 2020, the FBI released a statement confirming that the case had been upgraded to a federal maritime trafficking investigation, but most of the evidence remained classified. There were too many unknowns, too many suspects, too many legal borders to cross. Claire Whitaker, now in her mid-50s, didn't stop pushing. She went on air again, this time with national coverage. Her voice, raw but unwavering, carried through televisions and live streams across the country. "We thought they were gone. We thought they fell. But they didn't. They were taken. And for 35 years, no one asked the right questions." She held up a copy of the forensic report, her sister's name at the top, and said, "This is not just about Mark and Lisa anymore. This is about everyone who disappeared at sea and never got asked why." The story reignited global attention. Social media campaigns launched #JusticeForTheWhitakers, #CruiseShipCoverUp, #SeaTaken. Within months, more victims' families came forward with stories eerily similar to Claire's. Brothers, daughters, parents, all gone from cruise ships or small vessels between 1980 and 1995, all written off as suicides or accidents. Many of those cases had occurred on ships owned by just two cruise conglomerates. It was no longer coincidence, it was pattern. Behind closed doors, the investigation turned inward. Government agencies began auditing maritime oversight failures, tracing how outdated international laws had enabled corporations and criminal networks to operate unchecked on the open sea. Among the findings, between 1980 and 2000, over 250 people were reported missing from cruise ships worldwide. Of those, only 14 bodies were ever recovered. Less than 10% of cases resulted in thorough investigations. In Lisa and Mark's case, forensic oceanographers even ran simulations based on currents, drift models, and weather from August 1985. Their analysis showed that if the couple had truly fallen overboard, their bodies would likely have washed ashore within 72 hours. But they didn't, because they never went overboard. They were taken off the ship and onto another, which begged the question, how? A breakthrough came in early 2021 when a retired cruise ship security officer from the Oceana Star stepped forward after hearing a podcast episode covering the case. His name was withheld from the public for safety, but he provided something investigators had never seen, a private logbook. In it, he had recorded unusual events during his time on the ship, unscheduled room changes, undocumented deck entries, passengers appearing on ship manifests without proper ID. One entry, dated August 21, 1985, read, "Deck 4 access disabled 11:30 p.m. No crew notice issued. External walkway lights shut off. Security cameras deactivated manually. 2 passengers seen walking aft toward stairwell. Last sighting." That exact time and location matched the window between the Whitakers' last confirmed sighting and the moment their cabin was found empty. For the first time, investigators had a timeline, a crack through which the truth could begin to surface. It appeared that a small group of actors, possibly insiders, had manipulated the ship's systems to isolate and extract passengers during a vulnerable window of the night, bypassing official logs, using dark decks and blind zones to smuggle them off ship. The missing room discovered during the Maris Sol conversion? Likely a makeshift holding cell or transfer area. And if this was done once, it was likely done again. As the scale of the operation came into focus, the emotional weight of the revelations deepened. Mark and Lisa hadn't died by misadventure. They had been betrayed. Not by nature, but by people. People who used the shadows of the system, who knew where to hide and how to wait. And, for 35 years, no one had seen them. But Lisa had left her voice behind. That cassette, water-damaged but enduring, became a kind of ghostlight for the case. Proof that she had fought, endured, and spoken, even when no one was listening. The final words on the tape, recovered after painstaking restoration, were barely audible, but they were hers. "If you find this," we didn't jump. "Please tell someone. Please find us." And someone did. The ocean gave back what was buried. The wreck revealed what the world had missed. And the case that had gone cold before most people had ever heard of it became a symbol of what happens when silence is allowed to win. Mark and Lisa Whitaker's story wasn't just solved, it was reclaimed. After 35 years, the world finally knew what happened to Mark and Lisa Whitaker, but knowing didn't bring comfort. Not the kind that erases pain, It brought something else, a sobering understanding that justice doesn't always arrive quickly or clearly or fully. Sometimes it washes up in pieces, and sometimes it sinks too deep to reach. For their families, the aftermath was like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. Claire Whitaker had spent decades holding on to a version of her sister frozen in time, young, full of joy, untouched by fear. She had fought for the truth, demanded it, uncovered it, but when the truth finally stood in front of her, it didn't feel victorious. It felt unbearable. Lisa had not died quickly. She had not died by accident. She had been stolen, her final moments shaped by confusion, terror, and pain. Mark, whose body was never recovered, was assumed to have died under similar circumstances. Investigators believed he may have tried to resist or protect Lisa, or escape. No one would ever know for sure. The revelation devastated Mark's family. His mother, now in her 80s, released a statement through a family friend. "He was a good boy, a strong boy. I never believed he jumped. I always knew he was somewhere. I just didn't know where." The Whitakers became unwillingly a public story, a symbol. News crews surrounded Claire's home. Documentaries reached out with interview requests. Podcasts recounted the story with chilling music and cinematic sound bites. But to Claire, this was never about virality or visibility. It was about memory, the kind that doesn't fade with time, the kind that can't be buried. She continued to speak. In front of cameras, at memorial events, in quiet courtrooms and Senate hearings. One moment in particular, captured during a 2022 testimony for the Whitaker Maritime Protection Act, moved the country. Claire stood in front of a panel of lawmakers and held up her sister's passport. She took this with her. She thought she'd be coming back. She didn't. This was never about bad weather or missteps or safety drills. This was about people who knew how to hide things and systems that made it easy to stay hidden. If my sister had gone missing on land, she would have been found. But at sea, she became a ghost. The legislation, which called for mandatory surveillance archives, stricter documentation of crew and passenger records, and formal investigative jurisdiction across cruise lines operating in U.S. ports, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2023. It was the first major overhaul of maritime passenger safety laws in decades. Claire didn't celebrate. She simply said, "It's too late for Lisa, but not for the next person." The ocean floor where the second vessel was discovered, the one that had held Lisa's belongings, was designated as a protected memorial site. Divers who explored the area found no further remains, but planted a small plaque into the silt, stabilized by metal rods. It reads, "In memory of Lisa and Mark Whitaker, taken but never forgotten." Each year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, a small group, including family members, marine investigators, and survivors from other unresolved cruise ship cases, returns to that spot by boat. They drop wreaths into the sea. No words, just silence, respect, reverence, and regret. The ripple effects of the case were vast. Multiple families came forward with eerily similar stories, disappearances that had been shrugged off, misunderstood, or never investigated at all. Cruise lines that once denied any wrongdoing were now scrambling to update their safety procedures and implement new policies. Survivor advocates began pushing for transparency in how disappearances at sea are reported, logged, and handled in real time. But there were still questions that no one could answer. What exactly was the purpose of the group behind these disappearances? Why Lisa and Mark? Was it ransom, trafficking, blackmail gone wrong? And how many others had vanished under similar circumstances, never to be found? The wreckage, the documents, the tapes, they told part of the story, but not all of it. No one has ever been formally charged. The individuals whose voices appeared on the audio tape remain unidentified. The fingerprints matched to Julia Reyes, the solo traveler who vanished from the Oceana Star in 1986, offered more haunting connections, but no leads strong enough to close the loop. The ocean, once again, keeps part of the truth for itself. But something else happened in the wake of all this. Something unexpected. People remembered. Not just the sensational headlines or the grim details, but the people. Mark and Lisa became human again in the public eye. Not symbols of a mystery, but symbols of love interrupted. Old friends shared stories on social media about Mark's dry humor, Lisa's contagious laugh, the way she hummed while folding laundry. A high school classmate posted a photo from prom. Lisa standing under silver streamers, holding a paper cup, eyes bright. Mark just behind her, caught mid-smile. There was a tenderness in how people began to speak of them, no longer as a case, but as a couple who deserved more than silence. In the years that followed, Mark and Lisa Whitaker's story became something more than a cautionary tale. It became a rallying point, a reason for people to speak up, to ask better questions, to stop accepting they must have fallen as a full stop. Cruise ships began adding small memorial spaces on board, quiet areas where passengers who vanished without explanation could be honored. A few lines of poetry, sometimes just a name carved into glass. In one such memorial, on a ship that now sails a similar Caribbean route to the one the Oceana Star took in 1985, there's a plaque that reads, "To those who went missing but were never lost, to the ones who remembered." Lisa and Mark's names are engraved just below. It's not justice, not really, but it's something. Claire visits that plaque once a year. She brings 2 items every time, a photograph of Lisa and Mark at the cruise terminal, arms around each other, laughing, and a copy of the letter she wrote to Lisa in 1995, the one she never sent. In that letter, Claire had written, "I still talk to you like you're here. I still imagine what you'd say when I do something stupid. I wonder what your laugh would sound like now. I think maybe I'm scared to find out, because if I let that go, maybe I let you go too." She never did. Claire eventually published a book about the case, part memoir, part investigation, titled Taken by the Sea. It became a quiet bestseller, not because it sensationalized what happened, but because it refused to look away. It wasn't about the crime, it was about the absence, the waiting, the ache. The book ends with a sentence that feels like a sigh. They didn't vanish. We just didn't know where to look. Among those most affected by the Whitaker case were other families of missing passengers, people who had long been told there was no foul play, no point in asking more questions. Now, they had precedent. Now, they had proof that some disappearances weren't accidents, but acts. Several cold cases were reopened. Some yielded new leads, others didn't. But even those with no resolution found a strange comfort in knowing someone had finally cracked the silence. Someone had proven it was possible. And for those who worked in maritime law and safety, the case became a catalyst for reform. New international agreements were signed between cruise operators and governments. Mandatory GPS bracelets became standard on most large vessels. High-definition surveillance now covers every corridor, every deck. And, more importantly, footage must be stored and made available to investigators. It came too late for the Whitakers, but not for the ones who came after. To this day, no one knows exactly who orchestrated the disappearances or how many people were involved. The original operators of the Fleur du Vent were never identified. The names on the recovered checklist remain mostly coded. It's likely that some of those behind the operation are dead. Others may still be out there, their roles buried in records lost to time or hidden under layers of paperwork, lies, and jurisdictional gaps. The sea doesn't give back everything, but in this case, it gave back enough to change things. Sometimes, in rare moments, people report hearing a voice when standing near the wreck site, a voice calling softly from the water. Of course, it's just the wind, the echo of waves against the hull. Nothing more. But those who've been there, the divers, the survivors, the family members, swear it's something else. Not a ghost, not a warning, a whisper, a voice saying, "We're here. Don't stop looking." And we shouldn't, because Mark and Lisa were here. They loved, they laughed, they danced. They were real. And now, finally, their story has been told. They boarded that ship with dreams in their eyes, wrapped in the kind of love that only exists in the beginning. Mark and Lisa Whitaker weren't just names in a file or faces in a news clip. They were two people who believed they had forever ahead of them. But forever was stolen. For 35 years their story drifted in silence, misfiled, forgotten, reduced to a line on a passenger log and a footnote in maritime archives. And in that silence, injustice lived. Not because no one cared, but because the truth was buried just deep enough to be ignored. It would have been easy to let it stay that way. Easier even to believe they simply slipped overboard. To tell ourselves it was just one of those tragedies that happens without explanation. But one person refused to believe that. And because Claire didn't stop, because she listened to the voice that said something was wrong, the truth surfaced. It didn't come quickly, it didn't come clean, but it came. And when it did, it changed everything. Because this story wasn't just about Mark and Lisa. It was about how we treat the lost. It was about what we do with the people who vanish when no one's watching. It was about how easy it is to look away, and how powerful it is when we don't. So now we ask you, what would you have done if you were the last person to see them on that ship? Would you have remembered something, reported something, asked the uncomfortable questions? And more importantly, are there people right now, vanishing in plain sight while we let the silence tell their story? You don't have to solve a mystery to honor the people in it. You just have to remember them, talk about them, say their names, because even if the ocean forgets, we don't have to. Mark and Lisa Whitaker, 1985. They were never lost. We just didn't know where to look.